So part 2 of the civil rights movement is going to occur from 1960 to 1965, and I always like to look at this part of the civil rights movement as, the movement picks up this idea of nonviolent civil disobedient protests from the 1950s, and there is media coverage, but the media coverage greatly increases, and what you tend to see is the movement being nonviolent, but people reacting with violence towards the movement, and therefore people see this and they've really gained the support of the middle class during this time period. So basically what I just said, they use nonviolent or civil disobedience for 2 main goals: the desegregation or integration, and that's going to be to end Jim Crow and increase African American voting rights. The first thing are going to be the sit-ins, which if you weren't at school, we watched a video about them. If you were, you remember the video. It's led by the SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which is an organization promoting civil rights for minorities. They're going to stage these sit-ins at white-only lunch counters to draw attention to segregation laws in North Carolina. The main one is going to be in Greensburg, North Carolina, at the Woolworth lunch counter. And the protest action is going to be copied across the country, growing to 100,000 protesters. And this was the Greensburg 4, I believe that they were called that. If you were in class, you saw the video. And this is another different lunch counter, one of the copies. Okay, so those were the sit-ins. And then you have the Freedom Rides in May of '61, which is not led by SNCC, it's led by CORE, which is the Congress of Racial Equality, which is another organization promoting civil rights for minorities, and it's going to be led by James Farmer. That's him right there. It's going to bring national attention to segregated bus terminals. And there's going to be 13 members, 7 black and 6 white, are going to ride buses from North Carolina to New Orleans to emphasize the lack of accommodations for minorities. And the protesters are going to be met with violence in Alabama. This map kind of shows you that they start here and that they travel all the way here, and it shows where they first encounter violence. Okay, one of the buses is actually going to be firebombed. And this is what it looks like. This is what it looks like after. This is a famous picture of the guy that is interviewed afterwards. It's on the bus. Okay. And in case there's any confusion, the terminals were actually segregated, and there were whites-only bathrooms and whites-only places to eat. And so what these people would do is when they got to the terminals, they were using the whites-only facilities, and they encountered tremendous violence, not just in Alabama, but in other places. And this all has to do, you go back to the Interstate Commerce Commission. It's regulated because it's interstate travel. So it is regulated by the Interstate Commerce Commission, and they are going to come out and issue an order that these facilities should be desegregated. Okay, what's going to happen at a lot of universities? So we talked about K through 12 public education with Brown versus Board of Education, but there's going to be, I'm going to back up real fast. Most importantly is that people are going to see on TV the amount of violence. Again, so we're talking 200-300 angry white people coming and beating these people up on the buses, and this is going to be shown on TV. And again, as an example of how there creates support, how support for the movement is created. Okay, moving on. So in October of '62, this is going to be 3 or 4 things about segregating universities. James Merritt is going to become the first black student to attend the University of Mississippi, or we know it as Ole Miss. JFK is going to have to use the National Guard to force the desegregation of the university over the opposition of Mississippi Governor Ross Barnett. The event is going to result in a riot on the Oxford campus that killed 2 people. And if you ever get a chance, I have not seen it, but there's a good ESPN documentary. They make really good documentaries called The Ghost of Ole Miss, but I've heard it's good. In '63, JFK is going to have to use the National Guard to force Alabama Governor George Wallace to admit 2 black students into the University of Alabama. And there they are, and there's Governor Wallace. And Governor Wallace is quoted as saying, "Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." And he is the reason why the song Sweet Home Alabama says in Birmingham they love the governor. They're referring to Governor George Wallace. And I said it was going to be 3 or 4 universities. It's just 2. But again, just like with Brown versus the Board of Education, the governor is refusing to let something happen, and national troops are having to be called in to enforce these desegregation policies. Between April and May of 1963, there's going to be a protest in Birmingham. The SCLC, which is the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So there's SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, and SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Council, which is a civil rights organization, which is what Martin Luther King is eventually going to lead. He's a minister at first, and then he becomes the leader of this organization. These are going to be a series of nonviolent protests against segregation policies in the city of Birmingham, Alabama, except for the local police chief, Eugene Bull Connor, is going to use fire hoses and police attack dogs on protesters that included teenagers and children. And of course, the media is going to get hold of this. There's excessive force. It's going to make the country very mad. It's going to increase the support for the movement. And again, it's not just that these protesters are nonviolent, but you add in the fact that there's teenagers and children. And this is what's going to inspire JFK to propose a civil rights bill to Congress that would outlaw segregation. Now, this is in April and May of '63, so get a time frame here, especially with Kennedy. Okay, and here's them using the fire hoses on the protesters. So you can imagine, don't know if you guys have ever know how much force comes out of a fire hose, water out of a fire hose, but it's pretty strong. Here's another picture. Here's another picture. These are the attack dogs that they used. It was very horrible. And they're just, again, just like at the lunch counters, just sitting, not doing anything, not retaliating. In August of '63, 250,000 protesters from multiple civil rights organizations joined together to march on Washington in support of Kennedy's Civil Rights Bill, and this is where Martin Luther King makes his I Have a Dream speech. The bill is going to fail to pass into law. This is August of '63. In September of '63, there's going to be a bombing in Birmingham. Klan members are going to bomb the 16th Street Baptist Church, which is normally a meeting site for regional civil rights leaders, and 4 children are going to be killed that are at choir practice. So you can imagine, again, violence against the movement. The movement is not violent. And here's the 4 children that are killed. And here's a picture of the church. And again, media coverage is going to solidify public support for the movement. And even the people that were reluctant, again, because it's kids, okay? So you start to see when the kids start getting hurt is when everything becomes even more and more and more support. I forgot to put this at the top. In June of '64, and so let's go back. In November of '63, Kennedy is going to be killed, okay? In June of '64, led by SNCC, remember the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, they're going to have the Freedom Summer, which is a campaign to increase the number of registered black voters in Mississippi. The effort's going to be met with violence when 3 volunteers, 2 white and 1 black, are going to be murdered by members of the KKK. There's the Freedom Summer. It was just out of order. Okay? Those are the 3 people. I think Mississippi Burning, there's a movie about this incident, and I think it's Mississippi Burning, if you've ever seen it. Media coverage is going to produce national support for the goals of the Freedom Summer and Civil Rights Movement across the nation. Okay, so you have violence at every turn against these nonviolent protesters. You have the sit-ins, they pour things on them. You have the Freedom Rides, they firebomb the bus. You have the Birmingham protests where you have the dogs and the fire hoses on them. You have Freedom Summer where 3 people are murdered. You have the bombing of the church. Nothing happens too bad at the March on Washington, but you have all of these non-violent actions by members of the civil rights movement, and they are met with violence. And the media sees this, puts it out there, and large support of the middle class. There's going to be a voting rights march in Selma in 1965 by the SCLC and the SNCC, and they're trying to increase the number of registered black voters in Alabama. On Sunday of March 7th of 1965, which is referred to as Bloody Sunday, 600 protesters attempt to march from Selma to Birmingham, but were stopped by Alabama state and local police, who used tear gas and police sticks to stop the marchers. So here again, another violent action towards the protesters. Televised images of the attack against unarmed and peaceful protesters shock American public and increase support for the goals, and convince President Johnson to use 2,000 federal troops to protect protesters in a new march on March 16th of 1965. So what are going to be some civil rights success? In January of '64, the 24th Amendment is going to be ratified that outlaws the use of poll taxes as a requirement for voting in national elections. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed discrimination against racial, ethnic, and religious minorities and women, outlawed segregation in schools, the workplace, and public facilities, which is legally the death of Jim Crow everywhere, not just in education. The Voting Rights Act of '65 outlawed literacy tests and other methods used to prevent minorities from voting and gave the federal government the power to oversee elections in states that had a history of discriminatory voting practices. It's still in effect today. And the Civil Rights Act of 1968 outlawed discrimination in the sale, rental, and financing of housing. And one thing you need to notice is that all of these things are going to come into play. A lot of people say that Johnson was able to get the support in conjunction with the fact that people saw how horrible these things were, but that a lot of people, after Kennedy died, people, this is what Kennedy would have wanted, and they're very sad about the death of Kennedy, and so it softened some people that voted for the Civil Rights Act of 1963 after his bill failed. So why was the movement so successful? We've kind of mentioned it already, but you should be able to figure out. Nonviolent civil disobedient protests, the TV and media coverage of these violent reaction by segregationists against these peaceful nonviolent civil rights supporters, and the middle class, specifically the white middle class, supported the movement and schools by 1964. And so then the next part is going to be part 3, which is where not the people against the movement, but the movement itself is going to become a little more violent.